Greetings, my name is Carrie and welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to be talking about my reading stats for May, but before I get into that, I need to talk about what is happening in the world right now. Like many of you, I have been really affected by the scenes in America of police brutality, the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. I've been doing my best on social media to try and promote the movement, to amplify the voices of the people who need to be listened to right now, who know more about this than I do, and I've been trying to learn. I've noticed in the last couple of days that the Twitter timeline is going back to normal, but at the same time I have found myself having some really challenging conversations with family members and acquaintances, people I barely know on Facebook, and this is far from over. This is not just a trend. So what I'm trying to say is I am committed to supporting Black Lives Matter for as long as it takes for the necessary change to happen, that Black people are not living in fear for their lives. I will be supporting in any way that I can. So the first thing is that from now on, well, I've already done it the last couple of videos, there's a link in the description to the card for all the different ways you can support the Black Lives Matter movement, and that will be there in all my future videos until someone tells me it's not needed anymore. I claim to read diversely in terms of author identities, and I've claimed that for a while, and actually one of the reasons that I started making these stats videos, or I started tracking the stats for that ended up being used in these stats videos, was because I wanted to hold myself accountable to that statement. Unless I actually had the stats, I couldn't know whether that was true or not. So I started tracking, and particularly the important thing is the author diversity. So whether authors are Black, Asian and minority ethnic, whether they are LGBTQIA plus part of that community, whether they have mental illness or have some other form of disability or neurodivergence. Those are the main stats that I try and track, both for authors and for characters in the novels I read. And what I found is I'm not doing as well as I would like to be, let's put it that way. I'll go into a bit more detail particularly about my stats for May in a moment, but looking back over the year on my spreadsheet, I've read some, but not as many as I would like it to be. And so I'm committed to changing that. I'm committed to increasing the proportion, particularly of authors of colour, that I read. I want to do better, and I'm going to keep trying to do better, and I'm also going to keep trying to promote and amplify the voices of Black content creators, Black authors. What I firmly believe is that if the only books you read are written by people that look and sound like you, then there's a problem there. To find out about people that are different from you, you have to listen to them and have empathy for them. And reading is one of my primary ways of learning about the world and gaining empathy for people. So I'm going to keep trying to do that. I don't feel like I'm being very eloquent, and I'm really sorry. And please do correct me if I make mistakes and help me to learn more. Yes, and hold me accountable to what I'm saying. Please do hold me accountable. Okay. If it doesn't feel too weird, I'm now going to talk about my reading stats for May. I added another column to the spreadsheet. The column that I added was the publication year of the book, because actually that can really have an effect, and one of the books I'm going to talk about in a bit, some of the problems with it are because of when it was written. And I was interested to track what years the books I was reading were written in. That is just something that I wanted to find out. I think it might also be more interesting if I actually, when I mention a book, or when I mention a statistic, that I mention the book that it's related to. But I'll give you an example of that in a minute. Anyway, right, so I read 15 books. I finished 15 books in May. Some of them I'd started a little while before. That was, I believe, 15 different authors as well. The longest book I read had 480 pages, so that was The Embers of Heaven by Alma Alexander. This is what I mean about specifying the book that relates to the stat. And because I have just decided to do this, I don't have those books to hand, so I will put up pictures of them. The shortest book that I read was Always by Yumi Yamamoto, who is a Booktuber, and that was a graphic novel, and I actually really enjoyed that one. So that was 34 pages long. So my total page count for books that I finished in May, and this isn't necessarily, I didn't read all of these pages in May, was 3,512, which gave me an average book length of 234.13 pages per book. So my average page length was about the same as April, but I read nearly 3 times, about 2.5 times the amount of pages, apparently. Although that is, as I say, fairly skewed because I just track the pages. I don't actually track exactly the number of pages I read in the month, if that makes sense. The oldest book that I read, the book that was published first, was published in 1907, and that was Father and Son by Edmund Gosse, and that is one of the books I'm going to be talking about a bit later in this video. And the newest book I read was, again, always by Yumi Yamamoto, which was published this year. In terms of star ratings, I gave 5 books 5 stars, 8 books 4 stars, and 2 books 3 stars. I also did DNF 1 book. The book that took me the longest to read took me 61 days, and that was Children of Dune by Herbert. And the book that I read quickest was Escape from Shangri-La by Michael Morpurgo, which took me 1 day. And so my average length of time it took me to read a book was 22 days. The book that had been on my TBR the longest was The Embers of Heaven by Alma Alexander. That had been on there for 2,064 days when I started reading it. That was one of the oldest books on my TBR, so I'm glad I've got that one cleared. And then there were a couple of books that I started reading straight away. So that was The Gifts of Imperfection by Brené Brown and Clergy in a Complex Age, edited by Jamie Harrison and Robert Innes. And both of them I started reading pretty much on the day that I got them. So that gave me an average length of time on my TBR as 461 days. And then whether they appeared on my TBR or not, 3 of the books were on my May TBR. 5 had been on my April TBR. Some of those I had started in April but didn't finish. 2 were on my March TBR, and 5 of them hadn't been on any TBRs at all. Okay, so of the books that were on my April and May TBRs, some of them were my book Death Row books, so I'm just going to quickly talk about them now before I carry on with the stats. You may remember if you watched my April stats wrap up that I carried over all 3 books from my book Death Row into May because I was slumping a little bit in my reading in April. Of those 3, I DNF'd one of them, which was The Confidential Agent by Graham Greene. I managed maybe 40-50 pages of this. I have enjoyed Graham Greene books in the past. I think I've read a couple, and his writing style, he tends to either be gritty but funny or just plain gritty. And I like the gritty but funny. For example, Alma and Havana, I really enjoyed that book. Less keen on the just plain gritty. I remember really not enjoying Brighton Rock when I read that a long time ago. So this one, I mean, as I say, managed about 40 pages and it seemed to fall into the just plain gritty category, and I just didn't have the energy to carry on with it. So this one is being on hold at the moment. The other 2 were both 3-star reads. So we have The Herring Seller's Apprentice by Elsie Tyler. I filmed a couple of recent reads videos which I haven't edited and uploaded yet. So I think I talk about this in more detail in one of those. It started quite promisingly, but I didn't really enjoy it by the end. It was way too predictable. Like, I figured out the mystery a long time before it got to the end, and that is disappointing in mystery novels. I like to be kept guessing. I like to have figured out some of it, but I don't like to get all the way there. I like the author to be cleverer than I am. And this was only okay in terms of the actual mystery. The 2 main characters were fairly annoying. Elsie was less annoying than Ethelred. Content warnings for fat shaming. The way Ethelred talks about Elsie is not pleasant. And it's not funny, and it was put in there intended as humour, but it wasn't funny. It was kind of trying to be a self-aware detective novel because the main character, Ethelred, is a writer of detective fiction, but it just came across as smug and full of itself, really. Like, it was sneering at the genre. I'm like, but you're sneering at tropes that you're using, so it was trying to use them in kind of an ironic way, but it didn't work for me. The final one was Father and Son by Edmund. Gosse. This is a memoir. This is supposedly, well, from the blurb, it implies that this guy had an awful childhood. It really wasn't that bad. I don't know, maybe I've just read too many books about child abuse. So Edmund Gosse's parents were very strictly religious. They were part of the Brethren, I think the Plymouth Brethren, who are a very strict sect of Christianity. And okay, so he had quite a lonely childhood. He didn't have many people his own age. His mother didn't believe, because of her belief, she felt that anything fictional was lying, so he wasn't allowed any novels or anything like that. So that, I mean, that kind of sucks. But I mean, it implies that his father was like strict and authoritarian and horrible to him, but it wasn't. I think the blurb was written by someone very anti-Christian and makes it sound much worse than it was. And also, from what I've read around the subject, actually even this account is not as truthful or as balanced as it claims to be. So the implication is actually that his father was actually even nicer than he's portrayed in this, which to me he didn't seem that horrible. But maybe that's just because I grew up not in a strict Christian family, but the church that I grew up in was formerly Brethren, and both my parents are from Brethren background, so I have a bit of an understanding of how that all works anyway. So maybe that was why it didn't come across as so awful to me. Content warnings, there's use of the N-word in here. So this book was first published in 1907, and this edition was published in 1972. Now, I don't believe that language has ever been acceptable, but at the time this was published it was considered more acceptable. Yeah, it really jarred to read it. It didn't feel okay. If you do intend to read this book, it's not a book I'd highly recommend, but if you're interested in learning a bit more about fairly Puritan upbringing in the 1850s, I do recommend trying to find a more modern edition if it's still being printed, which I don't know if it is or not. And what I will say as well, actually, is what I didn't know and what doesn't come across in the book, but I found out from doing a bit of wider research, is that this guy's dad, Mr. Gosse the Elder, was a marine biologist. He invented aquariums. Should have talked more about that, Edmund Gosse, because that is a really sweet thing that your father did. Anywho, so that was my April book death row books. On to my May ones. One of them I decided I just didn't feel like reading, so that is The Talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith. I watched the film a few years ago. Didn't love the film, and so don't feel greatly drawn to reading this book, and it's been sat on death row for ages. I'm like, surely if I wanted to read it, I actually would have picked it up by now, so that one's being unhauled. And then the other one is The Secret Women by Victoria Holt. So I am in the process of reading this. I am about 2/3 of the way through, and I'm really enjoying it. It is slightly problematic. It's just one of the tropes used in it. It's a slightly problematic trope, but I'll go into that a bit more when I have finished reading it, because I don't yet know how that particular thing will turn out, and I know I'm being very vague, so you'll have to watch the video, a future recent reads video, to find out what I'm talking about with that, I'm afraid. Okay, so of the books that I read, 5 books were new this year, 3 books came from the library, and 7 books were from my owned TBR, so that is pretty good, really. Fairly good mix there, but also working through some books on my TBR. I know what I forgot to say. At the start of May, my TBR had 564 books on it, and my book death row had 36. By the end of the month, those had actually both gone down, which is pretty good. Seeing as I actually did still buy quite a few books in May. By the end of the month, my TBR had gone down to 562 books and my book death row had gone down to 29. So I'm really happy with that. That was a mixture of deciding that I didn't want to read a few books and actually reading some of the books that I own. So yeah, that was pretty good. I read 2 hardback books and 1 graphic novel that I've already mentioned, and then the rest were all paperbacks. In terms of genre, I read 3 Christian non-fiction, 2 regular non-fiction, 2 memoirs, 2 mystery stories, 3 fantasy, and 1 science fiction fantasy, which was Children of Dune, which to me is somewhere between science fiction and fantasy. 2 contemporaries as well. I read 1 YA book and 1 children's book, and then the rest were all adult books. And I read quite a mix of publishers as well, including 8 from independent publishers, which is brilliant. Compared to the previous month where I didn't read any, that I'm really happy with that as a stat. I read a wider range of author nationalities, so it was still predominantly British and American. There was 1 book which had multiple authors, but actually I think all of those authors were probably British as well. And then I read 1 Dutch author and 1 Lithuanian author. So it's still more I could do to be reading more diversely in terms of author nationality. And then in terms of author genders, as I say, 1 book was from multiple authors, 1 book was from a non-binary author, 5 were from cis men, and 8 were from cis women. I'm glad that it was predominantly women, but I could do a bit more to be reading some more marginalised genders, and I will keep trying to do that. For my challenges, 8 books were counted for the Indie Challenge, 8 books from independent publishers, really happy with that. 7 books counted towards my Start on Your Shelf-a-thon for the year, so that was really good as well. Finished 2 books from my book Death Row and unhauled 2 others. Unhauled all of them actually. And then 1 book counted for Read Around the World, which was Shadows on the Tundra for Lithuania. And I completed 1 series as well, which was The Embers of Heaven. Hi, editing Kerry. I decided to refilm just this little section because I've been following a couple of conversations on Twitter about the term that I've been using in my stats, which was Black Asian Minority Ethnic, BAME, sometimes called BAME. I've realised that for some people that is actually quite a problematic term in itself. It's a bit too much of a catch-all. It's lazy shorthand really, and that is what I was using it for as well, and actually I'm not happy with using that term anymore. I also don't particularly like the term person of colour for the same reason, and I know that there is some disagreement about who is actually included in the term person of colour, and I believe there's another one which is BIPOC, which it feels more American centric, and I'm not entirely sure how that defines people either. What I'm trying to do with this part of the stat is figure out the different ethnicities and marginalised ethnicities that I'm reading from. So that is the term I've decided to use as a sort of heading, and please let me know if you are not happy with that term. What I'm actually going to try and do with that column is figure out quite specifically which ethnic group the author comes from, and if they are not from a white background, or even sometimes if they are from a white background but it is one that is traditionally marginalised, then they will be counted in this column. So for example, for May, I read 1 book from a Black African American, 1 book from an East Asian author, East Asian American actually, I believe, and then 1 book was from an Eastern European white author, which was Shadows on the Tundra, which I've just mentioned was my Lithuanian author. I've included that because the book is about how the Lithuanian people were oppressed under the communist regime during the Second World War. So I've gone back through the whole spreadsheet for the year and tried to be more specific about the author ethnicities, and that is what I'm planning to do moving forward. I don't want to use a lazy catch-all term that just defines people who are not white and others them. That's the problem I have with that term, is that it's about saying they're not white, and that's not what this is about. This is about trying to read more diversely and amplify marginalised authors. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, as I say, please do correct me if you think what I've just said is wrong and there's a better way that I can define this, then please do let me know. So back to me to carry on with my author diversity stats. Thanks. 2 books were written by people from the LGBTQIA+ community. 1 book was from an author with a disability. 4 books were written by people with some form of mental illness, and 2 books were people with a form of neurodiversity, I believe. This is based roughly on what I can find out about them from their own websites or from Wikipedia, so it may not be the most accurate information, but I'm doing my best to find out what I can about the authors. And then in terms of character diversity, I use the same markers. I hit all of those markers multiple times, some more than others. I'll still be trying to read a wide range of character diversity, but what I've realised particularly recently is that actually it matters more to me that I'm hitting the author diversity markers than the character diversity, because if the person writing the book looks like me then that may not be the best representation of those voices. So I'm aiming to read as much own voices as I can, but I think it is still important for, particularly for white authors, to try and have diverse characters and to do that well, and that requires a lot of sensitivity from those authors, but actually it is even more important to hear from a diversity of people, so from people of colour and from people from the LGBTQIA+ community, etc. So I will keep trying particularly to read a diversity of authors, as I've said. Okay, so best and worst books of the month, and then I will let you go. My worst book of the month I've already mentioned, that was The Herring-Fellows Apprentice by Elsie Tyler. I'm not going to talk about it again because I'm bored of it. Favourite book of the month? I couldn't pick. I read a lot of really good books, so I'm going to very briefly talk about 3 of them. So 2 of them I've already talked about in recent reads videos, one that you will have seen and one that you won't have seen yet, I don't think. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about them. I'll go into more detail on the 3rd one because I haven't put it in a recent reads video yet. So the first one I'm just going to briefly mention is Return of the Prodigal Son by Henri Nouwen. This is a series of reflections on the painting by Rembrandt, which you can see on the cover there, and the parable from the Bible that inspired the painting. Henri Nouwen was a Catholic priest, but he struggled to find self-worth. I believe he was gay, and in the Catholic Church really struggled with that identity, and it made him feel unlovable. So a lot of this book is about learning to let yourself be loved by God, and it was really, really powerful. And even more so because I didn't know when I was reading it that he was gay. That was something that came up because this was our book club book for May for my theology book club, so that came out in the discussion when we were talking about the book, and that just added more depth to this book. I really, really loved this. To me, as a Christian, the central teaching of what I believe is that God loves people. So if you want to learn more about that, this, I would say, is a good place to start, particularly if you're interested in art and art history. He talks a lot about Rembrandt's own experiences as well. I really, really love this. The next book I have talked about in a recent reads video that hopefully you will have seen. I finished this at the start of the month before Black Lives Matter movement came back to the world's attention, and this is a really powerful book about rewriting our flawed history. So this is Black Tudors by Miranda Kaufman. When I picked it up, I thought that Miranda Kaufman was black, but she actually isn't, but she is a very well-educated historian, and she's done a lot of research with a number of black historians as well to put this book together. So this retells the story of a number of black men and women living during the Tudor period in Britain, particularly in England, and it retells their stories, brings their stories to life. And I think this is really valuable, and I'd really recommend this if you have an idea of what you think the history of black people in the UK is, because this shows that actually the narrative we have about the oppression of black people is flawed. It's not always been that way. There was a time before slavery when black people had equal citizenship. Yeah, really highly recommend this if you want to start rethinking the history of the UK and its relationship to people of colour and how we tell those stories. If you were forcing me to pick one of the three books to talk about, to say that this one was my favourite, it would be this one. This is The Deep by Rivers Solomon. Rivers Solomon is a non-binary author of colour, and this is the second book of theirs that I've read. I read An Unkindness of Ghosts a couple of months ago and loved it. This had been on my Amazon wishlist and someone very kindly gifted it to me. This was so powerful. It is about an underwater people that are the descendants of African pregnant women who were thrown overboard during the slave trade because they were considered too much of a drain on resources to keep them on board. So they were thrown overboard. There's a lot in this book about collective grief and collective memory and the memory of suffering and of oppression. I read this a week ago at time of filming, so I was reading this as the protests were really starting to get underway, and it really hit me, really hit me, the weight of centuries of suffering and what that must feel like. The central character in this is Yetu, who is the historian for her people. She holds all the memories of all of her people, and then once a year she retells those memories to the community who live in a state of unremembering. So they live their lives without thinking about their people's past, and then once a year she retells their history to them, and she is struggling under the weight of this history. And so it is about her search to find her own identity, both within her community and outside of it. And I just found it really powerful, and it was inspired by a song from a group called Clipping, and I listened to that song. It's a piece of rap music, which is not generally my genre, but it was a really powerful piece of music to listen to as well. I really highly recommend this. I don't have words to explain what this book meant to me, and I can only imagine what it would mean to someone reading it from the demographic that it represents. I suppose what I want to end with saying is it has sometimes felt hard to know what to say in the face of so much suffering and feeling powerless to do very much about it. But I want to echo what I said at the beginning, that I will keep trying to use my voice to uplift the people around me that are suffering. And at the moment, particularly, that is black people. Black Lives Matter.